South Sudan is located in the central eastern part of Africa near Uganda and Ethiopia. With a population of almost 13 million people, the South Sudanese are primarily pastoralists and live among the poorest countries in the world. Most villages in the country have no electricity or running water, thus the country's infrastructure is lacking. Living within the country are a grand and diverse indigenous population known as the Nilotic peoples. There are as many as 25 ethnic subdivisions, the largest being the Dinka and NURS tribes. A history of colonization, alternate ideologies, slavery, and civil war have created a central health issue of structural violence, depriving the Nilotic people of the social determinants of health.
From a critical social theory perspective, the poor health state of these indigenous people can only be understood through the complex interaction of power differentials and social inequities. Thus, many factors have contributed to an environment of structural violence where health is threatened.
Calculated, cold-blooded genocide that is going on. And this government claims to be a government of the Sudan. It isn't. It's a government of killers. It should be condemned. Sanctions should be made against this government. It should be isolated.
The source of oppression and marginalization of the Nilotic people has evolved out of social and political structures that have created a systemic disadvantage.
In the early 1500s, tribes settled in southern Sudan near the Nile River and became known as the indigenous Nilotic peoples. In 1821, Egyptian forces permeated southern Sudan, imposing Islamic law. The indigenous people became enslaved and displaced as domestic servants. In 1899, Sudan was colonized by Egypt and Great Britain. However, Britain dominated and suppressed the Nilotic people and their religion. In 1958, a series of post-independence civilian and military regimes failed to reconcile deep-seated differences between the South and North. In 1972, a 17-year civil war ended with a granting of the South regional government and local autonomy.
The peace did not last long, as the civil war was sparked again preceding South Sudan's independence in 2011 and remains a current conflict. This war has severely disrupted the economy of South Sudan and has led to sexual abuse, abduction, property theft, and recruiting child soldiers for the militia. Politically motivated violence has also divided the Dinka and NURS peoples. Other smaller ethnic minorities have been drawn into the conflict as victims punished for perceived support of opposing forces.
Nilotic people are strongly linked to the areas in which they have long resided. Cultural practices and traditional knowledge are linked closely to self-sufficiency and local livelihoods. Their ideologies are reinforced by social institutions such as the family, clan, and tribe. Violence related to displacement in South Sudan has disrupted this fragile balance as they depend on their herds of cattle for economic stability, basic nutrition, and social interaction.
How the structural violence impacts the health of the Nilotic people. The civil war has led to a humanitarian crisis where the Nilotic people are forced to flee without adequate food, shelter, and medical attention. Malnutrition is prevalent year-round, especially among children. South Sudan's maternal and infant mortality rates are among the highest in the world, with the infant mortality rate of being 62.8 deaths per 1,000 live births compared to Canada's 4.2. Reasons for this may include a shortage of healthcare workers, facilities and supplies, poor roads, and a lack of transportation. In February of 2017, the country declared a state of famine and later announced the end of its longest ever cholera outbreak that reported over 20,000 cases and 436 deaths. A peace deal was implemented in August of 2017 after months of negotiations. However, it had limited impact and failed to halt the country's ongoing humanitarian crisis. The previous information is taken from an EDIC approach to cultural study. We dove into a multitude of resources, perspectives, and theories that originated from outside the Nilotic culture.
From the emic approach, the Nilotic people hold a traditional animistic worldview. They connect their ancestral spirits through ash-handling practices and animal sacrifice to a supreme being called Quoth. The NURS pray for health and well-being, hoping Quoth will answer their petitions. Many individuals serve as diviners and healers. The Etic perspective suggests that an end to structural violence and increased accessibility to modern healthcare is the solution to health issues. However, the Nilotic people desire an end to structural violence as they are strongly linked to the areas in which they have long resided. This will in turn enable a restoration of their traditional knowledge and promote their self-sufficient healing practices.
As compared to the Hmong people in the narrative, the spirit catches you and you fall down, the traditional ideologies and cultural practices of Indigenous people include sacrificial practices to fight disorders of the body and spirit. Although urban elitists have benefited from innovations that question these practices, in order to grasp holistic health of the people group, the core of their identity must be respected and accommodated while structural violence is addressed.
Decades of civil war in South Sudan have negatively impacted the general quality of life and welfare of the indigenous people. This structural violence has resulted from a history of colonization, as well as disruption of religious, economic, environmental, and political ideologies. This resilient people group continues to face long-lasting detrimental effects of violence, decreasing the quality of their health.